Let's begin. Floating it as Nixon was doing, and then letting it sink like a stone, looked a lot like a lie to me. Over the decades since, I've repeatedly seen policymakers deliver such assurances immediately before currency devaluations. So I learned not to believe government policymakers when they assure you that they won't let a currency devaluation happen. The more strongly they make those assurances, the more desperate the situation probably is. So the more likely it is that a devaluation will take place. As I listened to Nixon speak, I wondered what those developments meant. Money as we known it, a claim check to get gold no longer existed. That couldn't be good. It seemed clear to me that the era of promise that Kennedy had personified was unraveling. Monday morning, I walked onto the floor of the exchange expecting pandemonium. There was pandemonium, all right, but not the sort I expected. Instead of falling, the stock market jumped about 4%, a significant daily gain. To try to understand what was happening, I spent the rest of that summer studying past currency devaluations. I learned that everything that was going on, the currency breaking its link to gold and devaluing, the stock market soaring in response, had happened before, and that logical cause-effect relationship made those developments inevitable. My failure to anticipate this, I realized, was due to my being surprised by something that hadn't happened in my lifetime. Though it had happened many times before, the message that reality was conveying to me was, you better make sense of what happened to other people in other times and other places, because if you don't, you won't know if these things can happen to you, and if they do, you won't know how to deal with them. Enrolling at Harvard Business School that fall, I was excited about meeting the extraordinary intelligent people from all over the planet who would be my classmates. And high as my expectations were, the experience was even better. I lived with people from all over the world, and we partied together in an exciting, eclectic environment. There was no teacher in front of a blackboard telling us what to remember and no test to see whether we remembered it. Instead, we were given actual case studies to read and analyze. Then we gathered in groups to trash out what we would do if we were in the shoes of the people in those situations. This was my kind of school. Meanwhile, thanks to the wave of money printing that had followed the demise of the gold standard, the economy and the stock market were soaring. The stocks were in again in 1972, and the fashion at the time was Nifty 50. This group of 50 stocks had fast and steady earnings growth and were widely believed to be a sure thing. As hot as the stock market was, I was more interested in trading commodities. So that spring, I begged the director of commodities at Merrill Lynch to give me a summer job. He was surprised because people from places like Harvard Business School weren't typically interested in commodities, which were considered an obscure stepchild of the Wall Street brokerage industry. Up until then, as far as I know, no Harvard Business School student had ever worked in commodity futures anywhere. Most Wall Street firms didn't even have commodity future divisions, and Merrill Lynch was small, tucked away on a side street, and furnished with basic metal desks. A few months later, when I was back for my second year at HBS, the first oil shock began. With prices quadrupling in a matter of months, the US economy slowed, commodity prices soared, and in 1973, the stock market took a dive. Once again, I was blindsided, but in retrospect, I could see that the dominoes had fallen in a logical sequence. In this case, the debt finance overspending of the 1960s had continued into the early 1970s. The Fed had funded this spending with easy credit policies, but by paying back its debts and depreciated paper money instead of gold-backed dollars, the US effectively defaulted. Naturally, with all this money printing, the dollar plunged in value. That allowed for more easy credit, which led to even more spending. The inflationary surge that followed the breakdown of the currency system sent commodity prices even higher. In response, in 1973, the Fed tightened monetary policy, which is what central banks do when inflation and growth are too strong. This in turn caused the worst decline in stocks and the worst weakening of the economy since the Great Depression. The Nifty 50 were particularly affected, plunging severely. The lesson: when everyone thinks the same thing, such as a sure bet the Nifty 50 is, it is almost certainly reflected in the price, and betting on it is probably going to be a mistake. I also learned that for every action, such as easy money and credit, there is a consequence. In this case, higher inflation. There is a consequence roughly proportionate to that action, which causes an approximately equal and opposite reaction: tightening of money and credit, and reversals. I was beginning to see things happening over and over again, which led me to see that most everything is another one of those air quotes. Most everything has happened repeatedly before for logical cause-effect reasons. Of course, being able to both properly identify which ones of those are happening and to understand the cause-effect relationships behind them remain difficult. Though most everything seemed inevitable and logical in retrospect, nothing was nearly as clear in real time. Because people chase what's hot and avoid what's not, stock investing fell out of favor after 1973 and commodity trading became the thing to do. With my background in commodities and my Harvard MBA, I became a sought-after property. Dominic & Dominic, a middle-sized 100-year-old brokerage firm, hired me as a director of commodities for $25,000 a year, which was near the top of what HBS graduate starting salaries were that year. My new boss paired me with an older, experienced guy who had lots of commodities brokerage experience, and we were assigned the task of setting up a commodities division. I was in way over my head, though I was too arrogant to realize it at the time. I probably would have learned a lot of painful lessons had the job continued, but the bad stock market took Dominic & Dominic under before we made such progress. As the economy unraveled, the Watergate scandal dominated the headlines, and I saw again how politics and economics intertwine, usually with economics leading. This downward spiral led people to become pessimistic, so they sold their stocks and the market continued to fall. Things couldn't have gotten much worse, but everyone was afraid they would. It was the mirror image of what I'd witnessed in 1966 when the market hit its top. And just as it was then, the consensus was wrong. When people are very pessimistic, they sell out. Prices typically get very cheap and action to improve conditions has to be taken. Sure enough, the Fed eased its monetary policy and stocks hit bottom in December 1974. At the time, I was single and living in New York. I was having a great time partying with friends from HBS and dating a lot. My roommate was dating a Cuban woman, and he set me up on a blind date with one of her friends, an exotic woman from Spain named Barbara, who could barely speak English. This wasn't a problem because we communicated in different ways. She thrilled me for nearly 2 years before we moved in together, got married, had 4 sons, and shared an amazing life together. She still thrills me, but it's too private a person for me to say more about her. While I worked in the brokerage business, I also traded my own account. Though I had many more winning positions than losing ones, I can only recall the losing ones now. I remember one big one when I owned pork bellies. For several days, the market for them was limit down, meaning that the price had fallen so low that trading had to be stopped. I later described the impact of this experience to Jack Schwager, the author of Hedge Fund Market Wizards. In those days, we had the big commodity boards which clicked whenever price change. So each morning on the opening, I would see and hear the market click down 200 points, the daily limit, stay unchanged at that price, and know that I had lost so that much more, with the amount of potential additional losses still undefined. It was a very tactile experience, and it taught me the importance of risk controls because I never wanted to experience that pain again. It enhanced my fear of being wrong and taught me to make sure that no single bet or even multiple bets could cause me to lose more than an acceptable amount. In trading, you have to be defensive and aggressive at the same time. If you are not aggressive, you are not going to make money. And if you are not defensive, you are not going to keep money. I believe that anyone who has made money in trading has had to experience horrendous pain at some point. Trading is like working with electricity. You can get an electric shock. With that pork belly trade and other trades, I felt the electric shock and the fear that comes with it. After Dominic closed its retail business, I moved on to a bigger, more successful brokerage firm. During my short stay there, it took over numerous other firms and changed its name several times, eventually becoming Shearson, though Sandy Whale stayed in charge through it all. Shearson put me in charge of its futures hedging business, which included both commodity futures and financial futures. I was the person helping clients who had price risk in their business manage them by using futures. I developed quite an expertise in the grain and livestock markets, which often led me down to West Texas and the agricultural areas of California. The Shearson brokers, cattle producers, and grain dealers I dealt with were great folks who brought me into their worlds, taking me to honky-tonks, dove hunts, and barbecues. We worked and had a blast together, and I built a second life with them that lasted several years, though my job at Shearson only lasted a bit more than a year. Much as I loved the job and the people I worked with, I didn't fit into the Shearson organization. I was too wild. For example, as a joke that now seems pretty stupid, I hired a stripper to drop her cloak while I was lecturing at a whiteboard at the California Grain and Feed Association's annual convention. I also punched my boss in the face. Not surprisingly, I was fired. But the brokers, their clients, and even the ones who fired me liked me and wanted to keep getting my advice. Even better, they were willing to pay me for it. So in 1975, I started Bridgewater Associates. Starting Bridgewater, bold. Actually, I restarted it. Just after I graduated from HBS and went to work in commodities at Dominic & Dominic, I'd set up a little business with Bob Scott, a friend from HBS. Along with a few pals in other countries, we made half-hearted attempts to sell commodities from the US to other countries. We called it Bridgewater because we were bridging the waters, and it had a good ring to it. By 1975, there wasn't much left of this commodities company, but as it did already exist on paper, I used it. I worked out of my 2-bedroom apartment. When a pal from HBS who I shared the apartment with moved out, I made his bedroom an office. I worked with another friend I played rugby with, and he hired a great young woman who worked as our assistant. That was Bridgewater. I spent most of my time following the markets and putting myself in the shoes of my corporate clients to show them how I would handle market risk if I were them. And of course, I continued to trade my own account. Pursuing a mission with friends to help clients beat the markets was much more fun than having a real job. As long as my basic living expenses were covered, I knew I'd be happy. In 1977, Barbara and I decided to have a child, so we got married. We moved into a rented brownstone in Manhattan, and I moved the company there too. The Russians were buying lots of grain at the time and wanted my advice, so I took Barbara on a combined honeymoon business trip to the USSR. Alright, that's it for today. 5 pages. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.